welcome to Psychological Testing and Assessment online lecture on personality testing, Holy Week edition. In one word, how would you describe your personality? Like intelligence, the definition of personality is also complicated. There are dozens of different definitions of personality. Some are more narrowly focused on the different aspects of the individual, whereas the others are more all-inclusive. For Gordon Alpert and Robert Holt, there are structures inside people that actually guides and determines behavior in lawful ways. Holt went on to say that these structures are our brain chemistry that changes along with learning. As we learn, submicroscopic structural changes occur inside the brain, and consequently, this determines our ultimate behavior. But for the purpose of our discussion, we will use the definition provided by our text, where personality is defined as an individual's unique constellation of psychological traits that is relatively stable over time. Or, it can also be defined as a relatively stable and distinctive pattern of behavior that characterizes an individual in his or her reactions to the environment. There are three concepts that we should be able to familiarize ourselves with and should be able to differentiate as we discuss personality. These are personality traits, personality types, and personality states. Let us begin by understanding what personality traits are. There is also no consensus regarding the definition of trait. But again, for the sake of convenience, we can use Guilford's definition of personality traits. And he said that personality traits are any distinguishable, relatively enduring way in which one individual varies from another. From this definition, we emphasize the word distinguishable, meaning behaviors labeled with different trait terms are actually different from one another. There should be minimal to no overlap between each trait term, such that one trait term is unique from the others. Take note of the qualifier relative. When we say relatively enduring, it doesn't have to be evident across all situations all the time. Let's take the example of a bully. What are the three personality traits that are commonly associated with being a bully? So say we have aggression, dominance, and hostility. Does this mean that the bully has to be dominant, aggressive, and hostile across all situations? Maybe not. Maybe in school, the bully is able to manifest these personality traits. Maybe at home, the bully is more submissive or subdued. But it doesn't mean that the bully stops being dominant, aggressive, and hostile. So, when we say relatively enduring, even the way it's manifested doesn't have to be consistent across different contexts and situations. Another thing to remember about personality traits is that its attribution is always relative. There are no absolute standards, meaning if one is to be considered hostile, if that is the personality trait associated with that person, then it's always in comparison to other individuals. It is also dependent on one's culture and context. One behavior may already be considered hostile in one culture, but on another, it's not. The context or the situation wherein a behavior is displayed is also something to consider when applying trait terms to behaviors. Now let's move on to personality types. Personality types are a constellation of traits that is similar in pattern to one identified category of personality within taxonomy of personalities. So, whereas personality traits are usually thought of as characteristics possessed by people, personality types are merely descriptions of people, but it has more far-reaching implications. So, you may want to think of it as a combination or a set of different personality traits. Say for example, your MBTI, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. It's a measurement tool that uses personality typology. And you yield 4 letters. Although it says in the manual that these are preferences, you may want to think of it as a personality trait for the purpose of this discussion. But each personality trait, when you combine them, you yield a personality type. So you have the ESFJ, the INTJ, the ISTP, and so on and so forth. And these different combinations of personality traits would say something about your worldview, your preferences, your interests. So that's how personality type works. Another personality typology that you may be familiar with would be Friedman and Rosenman's type A or type B. So if you are a type A personality, you may be more hasty, you may be more restless, you like rushing into things, you like working, and a type B personality is just the opposite of that. So again, like I mentioned, it's a combination or a set of personality traits. Now, what are personality states? Personality states is the transitory exhibition of some personality trait, a relatively temporary disposition. So, for example, a friend who is known to be gentle and subdued may actually be in a hostile state when faced with a threat. So, it's more fleeting rather than enduring. So, bearing all these things in mind about personality traits, types, and states, we now move on to how to measure it. We now answer 5 basic questions about personality assessment, starting with the first one. Why do we need personality assessment? In general, we know that personality assessments can yield to an evaluation of a person's socio-emotional functioning, more specifically intrapersonal functioning and interpersonal functioning. When we discussed the applications of psychological assessment across different settings and contexts, we also talked about the different kinds of tests and sources of data that can be utilized in each of these settings. And we mentioned that personality testing is commonly used across different contexts. In the industrial setting, the use of personality assessments is crucial to make sure that there is person job fit. We have been made aware that academic problems may also be due to other things, not just cognitive difficulties. Sometimes it can be a mismatch between the student's personality and the academic environment or the school's educational system. So, personality assessment is also important to be able to uncover these things. In the legal setting, say for example in adoption cases, it is also imperative to be able to evaluate the readiness of the prospective adoptive parents in taking care of the child. So, personality assessment is utilized in these cases. Now we move on to the who of personality assessment. We ask the following questions: who is being assessed and who is doing the assessment? For the first question, we have already learned in class before that it is usual for personality tests to get the information from the test taker himself or herself. So in this case, the test taker is doing a self-report or evaluating himself or herself based on these questionnaires. Like for example, if you're asked this question on a scale of 1 to 5, how friendly are you? Then you're the one who's doing an evaluation of yourself. So in essence, personality tests actually measure self-concept or one's attitudes, beliefs, opinions, and related thoughts about oneself. It's how you see yourself. The more you know yourself, the more accurate your self-concept would be. And the more differentiated your self-concepts would be as well in the different roles that you play. However, not all people are able to reflect about themselves all the time. No, it's not a practice that most people commonly do. So, in effect, in using the self as the primary referent in personality assessments, you run the risk of measuring personality inaccurately. So this is where the use of an informant or a third-party referent comes in. Sometimes, aside from giving the test taker a self-report questionnaire, it's also complemented by a form that is answered by a family member or a friend or a teacher, so that the answers from the test taker himself and the informant can be validated, can be cross-checked with each other. This also gives a broader insight about how the test taker is across different contexts and situations. So if you're asked this question on a scale of 1 to 5, how friendly is your partner, then you become the informant or the third party referent. But of course, it also comes with a downside. Similar to the disadvantage of a self-report questionnaire, if the third-party referent or the informant does not know you so well, then it can also lead to inaccurate results. And that is why it is important for the assessor to be able to identify individuals that can give a more substantial information about the person being assessed. Aside from that, there are also individuals who tend to respond to questionnaires a certain way in general. Like, for example, there are people who tend to give ratings in a favorable particular direction. So they tend to commit the leniency or generosity error. Then there are those who tend to gravitate towards the middle response. So they commit the error of central tendency, or the tendency to rate everyone near the midpoint of a rating scale. So yes, there are disadvantages to utilizing only a self-report measure of personality or solely asking a third-party referent to make the evaluations. And that is why, as I've mentioned, it is common practice to utilize a combination of both. Now let us answer the what. Of course, we want to know what is being measured when we say that we are conducting a personality assessment. So, what exactly are we measuring when we say we are conducting a personality assessment? So, this deals with the primary content area. And as I've mentioned several times over in class, that there can be different kinds of personality tests, and it can measure any personality variables such as the different personality traits, can also measure personality states or interests, worldview, values, attitudes, even cognitive and behavioral styles. So all of these can fall under the umbrella of personality assessment. But it's a little known fact that aside from the primary content area, you also may be able to evaluate the individual's response style or his or her tendency to respond to a test item or interview question in some characteristic manner, regardless of the content of the item or question. Meaning, you can also get some relevant information as to how the client or the test taker process these information, these questions that he or she is faced with in the context of the testing situation. Like, for example, there are people who tend to respond yes or true to all of the items or most of the items instead of giving the opposite answer, which is no or false. And that's what we call acquiescence. What you're maybe more familiar with would be what we call socially desirable responding, or the tendency to present oneself in a favorable or socially acceptable light. So, it yields to inaccurate results, but it is typically observed when the questionnaires or measures can yield to results that can be judged morally. if it has implications as to how they would be seen, whether they would be seen as good persons or bad persons. Then there are those who tend to respond no or false to questions or items in a scale in general rather than yes or true, and this is what we call non-acquiescence. And there are those who tend to respond deviantly to items in a scale. They tend to make unusual or uncommon responses. In contrast to those who tend to choose the middle rating, there are also those who tend to make extreme ratings. So they tend to either give the highest or the lowest possible rating. Overly positive response style may be somewhat similar to socially desirable responding. However, the former may be more general, and the latter may take into consideration what the test taker thinks the evaluator would like to see. And so he or she would respond in a particular way that would satisfy that expectation. Whereas in overly positive response style, the general tendency is to show that the test taker is good, is the best. Then we have the gamblers who tend to guess when in doubt, and those who are overly cautious who tend to not guess when in doubt. Some test takers engage in what we call impression management, which is an attempt to manipulate others' impressions, in this case the evaluator's impressions, through the selective exposure of some information coupled with the suppression of other information. For example, I know of a person who went through a psychological assessment process, which includes personality testing, in order to become eligible to join the management trainee program in their company. See, this is a very prestigious program and a competitive one. And if any one of them showed any sign of weakness and quote unquote failed the assessment, then they would lose their slot. So there is that urge to make a good impression, not just in the interview, but also in the tests that they're taking. So there's the concealment of certain information in order to highlight their better qualities. And so this person went on to tell me that the tests that he took were so transparent, were so obvious in what they wanted to measure. And so it became fairly easy for him to manipulate his answers to his favor. And here's where the validity scale comes in handy. Not all personality tests would include a validity scale, but there are those that developed this particular subscale of a test designed to assist in judgments regarding how honestly the test taker responded and whether observed responses were products of the response style, carelessness, deliberate efforts to deceive, or unintentional misunderstanding. So yes, before you entertain the idea of manipulating your answers in a personality assessment questionnaire, keep in mind that there are some tests that have that power to know whether you answered honestly or dishonestly in these questionnaires. And this is because if you get inaccurate results, then basically all of them are invalid and could not be used as basis for your evaluation. So now let us move on to the where of personality assessment. Where are personality assessments usually conducted? So there are traditional sites for personality assessments like schools, clinics, hospitals, assessment centers, and others. But it can also be done through observation in natural settings. So now we move on to the how of personality assessment. More specifically, how are personality assessments structured and conducted? There are two main classifications of personality assessment. So we have structured and unstructured. But we will talk about them in detail in the next part of this discussion. But for now, more importantly, when we talk about procedures, personality assessment can be done not only through paper and pencil tests or online questionnaires, but it can also be through observation, behavioral observation, through interviews, and case history, meaning you can get insights about the person's socio-emotional functioning, intrapersonal functioning, or interpersonal functioning through these other sources of information and not just through personality testing. But when we talk about personality tests in particular, we may encounter different item formats, and I'm sure you have encountered some of them in the past. Like, for example, the most popular Likert scale, wherein you're presented with several items and you have to give your rating, usually between 1 to 5, in terms of how much you agree or disagree with these statements. And then we have the semantic differential scale, wherein the test taker is asked to respond to a statement by choosing between two polarized options along with some middle of the road options. And then we have the forced choice format, wherein the test taker is forced to choose between two statements depending on how much he or she agrees with or identifies with either of these statements. And then we have the adjective checklist, wherein a list of adjectives are provided, and the task of the test taker is to choose from among these adjectives which ones describe him or her the best. We have sentence completion format, wherein the incomplete sentence is provided and the test taker would have to complete the sentence, obviously. And finally, a true or false format, which you all know what that looks like. Personality tests can also differ in terms of scope. So there are those that are broad and may measure multidimensional personality constructs. And then there are those that are more narrowly focused, which are designed to measure a certain dimension of personality. When we talked about the different ways personality tests are developed, we touched on the theoretical strategies, and it tells us that there are some personality tests that are founded on established psychological theories or frameworks for understanding that particular construct that the test would like to measure. But then there are also those that are atheoretical. It is also important to take note of the frame of reference of the personality tests or the aspects of the focus of exploration. For example, it can be in terms of time frame. So there are tests that would ask you to recall your behaviors from the past month. Yet there are also those that would ask you to answer in a more general fashion. And there are also measures of personality that may yield different results depending on the context, and so the context is provided beforehand. So, like for example, there are personality tests that would require you to think about your behaviors and thoughts and feelings in a particular situation only. So that provides the parameters for you to evaluate yourself in. And of course, finally, personality assessment measures differ in terms of their scoring and interpretation. And before we officially end this particular part of the discussion on personality assessment, let me just bring up an issue that has been the focus of debate within the field of personality. So essentially, there's this one camp that says that personality traits exist in all people to varying degrees, meaning that individuals can be compared across a continuum of personality traits that all people share. Okay? So, in the nomothetic view, It emphasizes comparability among individuals, but sees people as unique in their combination of traits. This viewpoint also sees traits as having the same psychological meaning in everyone, and that there is a belief that people differ only in the amount of each trait. And it is this which constitutes their uniqueness. And so, the use of personality tests, self-report questionnaires like the NEO personality inventory agrees with the nomothetic view. Okay? On the other hand, the idiographic view sees people as having unique psychological structures and that some traits are possessed by only one person and that there are times when it is impossible to compare one person with the others. And so, it emphasizes that traits may differ in importance from person to person. So, as a consequence, the evaluation of a person's personality or the assessment of a person's personality would have to be done through case studies, evaluation of bibliographical information or case history for information gathering, and not through self-report questionnaires or other structured personality measures. Now let's talk about the different ways to measure personality and the specific tests that do that job. There are two main classifications for personality tests. On the one hand, we have the more structured personality tests, which we call the objective personality tests, and on the other, we have the more unstructured personality tests or the projective personality tests. Objective methods of personality assessment characteristically contain short answer items for which the examinee's task is to select one response from the two or more provided. Examples of objective methods of personality assessment would be your Myers-Briggs Type Indicator and your NEO Personality Inventory. Both of these tests ask you to respond in a certain way to each of the items in the test. And the interpretation of these kinds of tests depend on the manner of your responding to each item. And there are objective measures on how to interpret these responses. So we can say that objective methods of personality assessment are structured, meaning there are guidelines on how to respond, and these are evident and specific. If you're the test taker who is taking an objective method of personality assessment or an objective personality test, there are clear instructions on what you should do in these tests. Objective methods of personality assessment also lack ambiguity. They have clear and definite stimulus. Like for example, in your NEO personality inventory, you have the statements to which you should respond with ratings depending on how much you agree or disagree with these statements. The examples given in this slide also makes it clear to the test taker what he or she should have to do. When it comes to scoring, it is done according to set procedures involving little, if any, judgment on the part of the scorer. And this is exactly why they are called objective methods of personality assessment, because the scoring and interpretation procedures have already been set, and it leaves little or no room for the evaluator to make subjective judgments. Similar to tests of intelligence or cognitive abilities, which are scored depending on whether they answered an item correctly or incorrectly, the same applies to objective personality assessment methods. So, if an item is answered a specific way, it can indicate the presence of that personality trait that is being measured. Or if it is answered the opposite way, it may indicate an absence of that personality trait that's being measured. A response on an objective personality test is scored with reference to either the personality characteristic being measured or the validity of the respondent's pattern of responding, as is the case with the validity scales. Objective methods of personality assessment is commonly used all around the globe. And this is because there are so many advantages to using these kind of personality tests. For one, items can be answered quickly, allowing the administration of many items covering varied aspects or dimensions of the trait or traits that it is designed to assess. Remember our discussion on test development? The broader the psychological construct or variable that is being measured, the longer the test may have to be because you have to include more items for the test to be valid. And it helps that the items can be answered quickly because of clearer guidelines on how to respond to each item. Items require little explanation, making it well suited for both group and computerized administration, such that there is little need for one-on-one supervision from the administrator of the test. It is also very efficient to use objective methods of personality assessment because the items can be scored quickly and reliably by varied means. You may also have someone else counter-check your work to ensure accuracy in scoring because there is a specific guideline on how to score the test. And finally, analysis and interpretation of such tests may be almost as fast as scoring. So it really saves you time, especially if you want to administer personality tests to a group of individuals on a short amount of time. Of course, if there are advantages, then there are also disadvantages. And the main beef about objective methods of personality assessment is that they're mostly self-report. And we have discussed earlier the cons of using a self-report. Although there are safeguards to ensure that despite using self-report methods of personality assessment, you can still get accurate results in the end, it seems like it's not enough. So these criticisms on objective methods of personality assessment gave rise to the projective methods. As expected, projective methods are unstructured, meaning there are only a few guidelines about what type of response is required of the test taker. When it comes to the tests themselves, the stimuli used are ambiguous, and the tasks are indirect, meaning the test taker is asked to talk about something else aside from the self. So it does not give anything away to the test taker. Through these indirect responses, the ability and inclination to fake is greatly minimized. So we can say that it kind of solves the problem of self-report measures of personality. So the projective method is a technique of personality assessment in which some judgment of the examinee's personality is made on the basis of performance on a task that involves supplying some sort of structure to unstructured or incomplete or ambiguous stimuli. It is based on the projective hypothesis that holds that an individual supplies structure to unstructured stimuli in a manner consistent with the individual's own unique pattern of conscious and unconscious needs, fears, desires, impulses, conflicts, and ways of perceiving and responding. These ambiguous stimuli used in projective personality testing can come in different forms. Most popular would be the ink dot, but it can also come in the form of a picture, or words, or even sounds. Later, you'll get to hear an interesting story about the use of sounds in projective testing. But another thing that is commonly used would be the production of figure drawings, and later, I'll tell you about specific tests that use this approach. One of the most popular projective methods of personality assessment would be those that use the ink dots as a stimuli. You may have seen them in shows, in movies, when they portray psychologists who conduct psychological testing and assessment. If we're talking about stimuli and personality tests or assessment, perhaps the ink blot is the paragon of ambiguity. You yourself can create your own ink blot. You get a sheet of paper and then drop ink in the middle or paint and then fold it in half. And there you go. You have your ink blot. And there's no reason behind it. It's not structured at all. So yeah, it is ambiguous. Of course, we have the Rorschach ink blots by Hermann Rorschach, composed of 10 bilaterally symmetrical ink blots on separate cards. When it was developed, there was no test manual, nor any instructions for administration, scoring, or interpretation. The only instruction is to ask the client or the test taker, what might this be? The test takers may rotate the cards, vary the number and length of the responses to each card, and the examiner records all the relevant information, including the verbatim responses, nonverbal gestures, and others. But as this test becomes more widely used, inevitably someone would have to create an instructional manual. So, in this existing manual for the Rorschach ink blot, the instruction is to administer the test for the first time, and during this first administration, the instruction remains to ask the client or the test taker what might the image be. On the second round, which we call the inquiry phase, the examiner attempts to determine what features of the ink blot played a role in formulating the test taker's perception of an image. Is it the foreground itself, or the background, or is it the shape of the figure, or the shade of the figure? And finally, on the third phase, which is the testing the limits phase, it enables the examiner to restructure the situation by asking more specific questions. A system has also been devised for ease of scoring. So the responses are scored according to location, meaning where in the ink blot or where in the card did the client or test taker see the image that he or she is referring to. Is it the entire blot, a large section of the blot, only a small section of it, or the minute details? For some people, they are able to interpret two small dots in the entire blot as something. Or some people also can see images in the white spaces. Responses can also be scored according to determinants. So as I've mentioned, some clients or test takers would depend on the form of the figure itself, the color, the shading, or some can even see movement. Responses are also scored according to content. So what they actually see. Did they see a figure of an animal, or a human, or something else? It can also be scored according to popularity. So there are responses that are common among different test takers. So these are the more popular responses. But then there are also others who would see entirely different images in these ink dots. And finally, it can also be scored according to form, or how accurately the individual's perception matches or fits the corresponding part. Of course, I cannot possibly tell you how these responses are interpreted. Actually, the Rorschach ink blot is studied as a full course or a full subject in the graduate programs in some institutions. So, this tells us that the projective method of personality assessment may require a certain set of skill and abilities on the side of the administrator or the evaluator. And then we have pictures as projective stimuli. An example of this would be the thematic apperception test. So in this test, the test takers are instructed this. This is a test of your creative imagination. Look at this picture. Your task is to make a complete story about it. Your story should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Try to portray who the people might be, what they're feeling, thinking and wishing. Try to tell what led to the situation depicted in the picture and how everything will turn out in the end. Write it down using as much paper as you need. So given this set of instructions, you would see that the test taker is not going to talk about the self. Rather, the test taker will be talking about the picture. And from that response, from the story that has been created, you can kind of infer what goes on inside the person's inner life. The thematic apperception test, or the TAT, is designed as an aid to elicit fantasy material from patients in psychoanalysis. It consists of 31 cards, and one of them is a blank card. The cards contain a variety of scenes designed to present the test taker with certain classic human situations. And the one blank card is there for the test taker to imagine a picture and make a story out of that imagined picture. As I've said, the TAT attempts to find out the source of the examinee story. When we say apperception, it refers to the perception in terms of past perceptions. So, it kind of tells us that however we perceive something, it's always a product of everything that we have learned in the past and everything we have assimilated from our experiences in the past and how we perceived our experiences in the past. So the raw material examined are the stories as they are told by the test takers, the notes about the way or manner the examinee responded, and notes about extra test behavior. The needs theory by Henry Murray is the framework used in interpreting the stories in the TAT. So for Henry Murray, we have needs, or the determinants of behavior, process, or the determinants of behavior arising from within the environment, and the thema, or a unit of interaction between these needs and process. So, however we created these stories, the protagonist would act in a certain way or behave because of these needs that may be experienced internally, and the process from the environment that pressures the individual to behave a certain way. And the interaction between these needs, internal needs, and process can propel the story. And although we're not instructed to use ourselves as the reference for the stories that we create in the TAT, the idea is it will inevitably seep through and become projected onto the stories that we create. And then we have the hand test, which is also an example of a projective method that uses pictures as a projective stimuli. So the hand test consists of 9 cards and 1 blank card. And in each card, there's a picture of a hand doing some sort of a gesture. And the examinees would have to describe what the hands are doing. It is interpreted according to 24 categories such as affection, dependence, aggression, and others. Another example of a projective personality test that uses pictures as ambiguous stimuli would be the Rosenzweig picture frustration study. This is commonly used among children, and it consists of several sets of comic strips that are incomplete, and the task of the client is to complete the conversation between the individuals in the picture. Again, the idea is however the client chooses to respond to the frustrating situation could say something about how he or she would respond to frustrating situations in real life as well. As I've said a while ago, words can also be used as a projective stimuli. And an example of this would be the word association tests. Word association tests are semi-structured, individually administered projective technique of personality assessment that involve the presentation of a list of stimulus words. to each of which an assessee responds verbally or in writing with whatever comes immediately to mind first upon first exposure to the stimulus word. In word association tests, responses are analyzed on the basis of content and other variables. Associations individuals made to words were not chance happenings, but rather the result of one's life experiences, attitudes, and unique personality characteristics. So that's the idea behind it. And of course, we have the sentence completion tests, which use the incomplete sentence as a projective stimuli. And in this kind of test, as you have observed from your own experience in answering one, there is a sentence completion stem, which is the part of the sentence that is provided. And on the blank part, the task of the test taker is to complete the sentence. And sentence completion tests are useful and straightforward way to obtain information from an honest and verbally expressive test taker about diverse topics. It may tap interests, educational aspirations, future goals, fears, conflicts, needs, among others. But because of its transparency, it is the most vulnerable to faking on the part of the examinee that is intent on making a good or bad impression. And finally, although this is not usually used currently as a projective method of personality assessment, once upon a time, a certain B.F. Skinner actually developed a sound apperception test. This is interesting because, as we know, B.F. Skinner is a behaviorist and not a fan of psychoanalysis. But once upon a time, he decided to create a personality test that uses the projective hypothesis. And so, in this test, a series of recorded sounds, such as muffled sounds or spoken vowels, were played in a verbal summator. It is a device created by Sol Rosenzweig and David Charcot, or it's also called the tautophone, and examinees are asked to associate to these sounds created by the verbal summator. Unfortunately, this did not take off, obviously. And then there's this whole other kind of projective method of personality assessment in which the test taker is asked to produce figure drawings instead of being presented with ambiguous stimuli. So, in the figure drawing tests, their responses or their figures that they have created are analyzed on the basis of their content and related variables. An example of this would be the Draw a Person test, wherein the examinees are given a pencil and a blank sheet of paper and are told to draw a person. When the examinees ask for further instructions, you just say, make it the way you think it should be, or do the best you can. So there's no explicit set of instructions that would elaborate on how the test taker would have to draw the person. So it's really up to them. And immediately after, the examinees are handed a second sheet of paper and instructed to draw a picture of a person of the sex opposite that of the person just drawn. And many clinicians ask questions, and these responses are used in forming hypotheses and interpretations. It's not just the actual figures themselves that are interpreted, as well as the variables related to the figure, such as the length of the body parts, or the clarity of the body parts, or the form of the body parts that are interpreted. But at the same time, their responses to questions such as who this person might be, what might this person be doing, would also be interpreted. And then other examples would be the kinetic family drawing, or the KFD, wherein the test taker is asked to draw a family doing some things individually or together. And the house tree person, wherein the examinee is asked to draw a house, a tree, and the person. And apparently, the way these elements are drawn in a sheet of paper would say something about the inner life of the person. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for sitting through this online lecture from start till end. And on Friday, we'll have our first and only long exam. Again, coverage will be from the beginning up to this point. And I'll see you on Wednesday.